Hey everybody, welcome back to Cityscape Brewing. I'm Dennis Fields. A little while ago on my channel, I posted a poll of several different things asking you guys what you want to see a video of. And the majority of people wanted to see a video on how to wash or reuse yeast, or wash or reuse the Trub at the bottom of your fermenter. And so I've just got done kegging a beer, an Oktoberfest, and I'm gonna show you how to reuse that Trub or yeast should you want to do, say, a second batch. So we're going to go through all of that, how to use the Trub, how to wash yeast, and what if you're using Kveik Yeast. There's even a separate process for that. So we'll go through all that after this. Also, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. Helps out the channel a lot. Appreciate every one of you guys. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what you'll need to get started. First, you're definitely going to need a fermenter with some Trub and yeast in it, right? You're definitely going to need a little bucket to help pour off and decant some of the leftover beer that's on the top. We'll do that first. You're going to need a glass fermenter of some sort, or it could be plastic, but something preferably that is see-through. You can do it in a bucket if you don't have one of these. It is easier because we're going to be putting this on its side and it has a little bit of a lip. So if you have a glass carboy, even if it's a small neck one, that's helpful, but you'll see why in a minute. Also, you'll need some mason jars like this one with some lids, a couple of those, maybe 2, maybe 4, depending on how much Trub or yeast you want to end up saving. And you're also going to need some water, preferably distilled water, but you can use tap water as long as you add a Captain tablet. Because if you don't add one of those, the chlorine in regular city tap water will affect your yeast, right? So the chlorine eats microbes and kills microbes, and one of the things that it will do is wreck your yeast. So you're going to want to go ahead and get distilled water or use a Camden tablet inside of your water, which I have done today. All right, we're going to go through the process. First and foremost, you want to get off the old beer, no matter what process you're going to do, and we're going to talk about 3 different ways of reusing this yeast. But the first one is you don't want any of that leftover beer in there. Okay, so without shaking it up too much, we're going to slowly tip this over and dump out as much of the old bad beer as we can. I shouldn't say bad beer, I just transferred it, so good beer, but beer we don't want to put in our next batch. So let's go ahead and slowly tip this without rousing the yeast cake up too much, and get that spent beer off there. And don't worry if you leave a little bit in there. What we're really just trying to do is get the majority of the beer. I'm gonna leave a little tiny bit because it looks like some yeast is coming out of there, but that's okay. We're gonna have plenty of yeast left in this, but most of the beer is now in there. All right, let's first just talk about reusing the Trub. So what you can do is just pitch a beer right on top of this Trub. Whether it's in this fermenter or a different one, you can mix this up. You can put another beer right on top of this thing and it will kick off. Shake it around real good, get that yeast back in suspension, and you're good to go. So if you're gonna make a double batch of something, say you're making your favorite pale ale IPA and it's the exact same recipe or something very similar, you can really just pitch the beer right on top of this yeast cake. That's perfectly fine, or even dumping this yeast cake into it after you've put it in a different vessel. Totally fine to do. So I don't wash my yeast all that often, but I do reuse the Trub quite often, especially if it's a similar style. What you don't want to do is go from a very, very hoppy IPA or something like that that has a lot of other hop particles and other things in here, and then dump that whole Trub into something that's not supposed to be as bitter or hoppy, like a saison or something like that. But you can go the opposite. You can go from a fairly mild beer into a really hoppy, bitter beer, no problem whatsoever. So when I do that, I actually just take my mason jars here, and then I'll swirl up what's left in my fermenter here. Give it a good swirl. And then what I'm going to do is just pour these into mason jars, and then I'm going to loosely put on the cap, not really snug, but enough so nothing can get in it, but it allows the bottles to burp a little bit, right? The jars to burp, and let some gas out. And so in this case, I will store those in my refrigerator, and then they will actually separate into the old beer, and then the yeast and Trub will settle on the bottom. And before I pitch that in my next beer, I'm going to decant off the top portion of that old beer, leaving a little bit of liquid to let it mix up again, warm that up on the counter the day of your brew day, and then pitch that whole thing into the next beer. So I do that quite frequently with Trub, and so you can leave that in your refrigerator for about 4 weeks or so. Anything more than that and the yeast is going to start dying off at a pretty aggressive rate. So you can make a starter out of it, but I wouldn't make one from Trub. You can from the washing yeast process, which we're going to do next, but with Trub I'd either use it or just chuck it. So use it within 4 weeks or just throw it. So in this case, I'm not gonna reuse the Trub. I'm gonna end up washing this one so we can go through that process. So for this, we've mixed this up a little bit. It's not really solidified on the bottom anymore, but what we're gonna wanna do is add water so we can get that yeast that's mixed in with all these other particles into suspension, and we'll show you how to do that. So we're gonna add a little bit of water. I have, again, regular water that I added a Camden tablet to. I'm gonna pour this in here. You don't need to add all that much, but you do need enough where, you know, it's pretty liquidy. So you wanna get that in there and then really mix it up. And that's what we're looking for, is that nothing's really stuck on the bottom anymore. It's really all in suspension off the bottom of the carboy. So you're gonna wanna do this. And then there's a lot of other Trub and stuff that's stuck on the side for this one. So what I like to do is actually put it in a different vessel. So I have the sanitized smaller carboy, which I'm gonna use. And I have my funnel. What I'm gonna do is pour this into here. So again, give it a good stir up. Slowly pour this guy into the bottom of here. All right, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna give this a good, swirl around again. Make sure nothing's real settling on the bottom, right? And then we're gonna set it actually on its side. And we're gonna do this carefully so it doesn't come out of the mouth of the big mouth bubbler. If it does, we can wipe it up a little bit, but we want to let it sit. So now we do this on purpose because we're gonna try and decant off the liquid that separates. We're gonna put some things, I always grab a couple things to make sure this doesn't roll anywhere. And then what I'm gonna do is let this sit for a half an hour. And when that half an hour goes through, it's gonna separate into several layers. You're gonna have the heavy sediment and particles that we wanna not use again on the bottom. Then it's gonna separate into like a milky liquid on the top, and you may even get a third layer on the very top that is really, really clear, which could just be the water. All right, so it's been a little over 30 minutes and I'm not exactly happy with how the 3 layers are turning out. I think it's gonna be kind of difficult to pour just the thin layer off the top of this because this carboy is so big. So I'm gonna show you an easier way to do this. And because of that, I'm gonna need a few more mason jars. So now I have 5 of these things sitting next to me. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna actually mix this back up, believe it or not. So I'm gonna take this and I'm actually gonna add some more water. I actually have some spring water here. So this is, again, non-chlorinated water. Again, you can use distilled. I'm gonna add more water into it. Then I'm gonna take and try to get a lot of this yeast off the side that has kind of settled on there again. So I'm gonna really just kind of shake this up without going, off over the lid, but try to swirl it as much as I can on the sides. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my funnel and I'm gonna pour them into several mason jars. And the reason I wanna do this is because it's more height and less surface area this way. The reason that's important is because you're gonna be able to see that separation when we wait. So I'm gonna take all 5 of these and I'm gonna fill them up. All right, guys, so it's been about a half an hour, a little bit more. I actually expected these to settle a little bit more, but it's kind of warm in my garage. I think if it were a little cooler, you would probably get, probably another inch more off this, but that's okay because I'm really not trying to save all that much. What we're gonna get for yeast out of this is gonna be more than we need for the next batch. So what we're gonna do is take a clean mason jar, we just sanitized this one, and we're gonna pour off the top layer here. So it's not as easy to see from this distance, but you essentially have 3 layers. You have the top layer, you have a small milky white layer, and then you have all of this trub and settlement on the bottom, all right? So what we're really wanting is this milky layer in the top, but you still have to get the top portion of the other one. Very carefully, we're gonna take each one of these and we're gonna just pour off the top layer of this liquid. It should be like a milkier substance. Don't worry if you get a little bit into the trub a little bit, okay? That's fine, but you don't want a lot of it. So get into that. I'm gonna pour about 1/4 and try to fill up this whole mason jar with all of this milky substance from the top of these mason jars. As you can tell, I've got quite a bit of separation still on the top, so I might take another small one here. I'm gonna go grab another one and try to get that last little bit, because you can see the separation, and there's a lot of yeast in those. And so what I'll do is I'll probably crash both and put them together. As much of this liquid off the top as I can. This one kind of being even a little more generous with the trub on the top, because some of that will have some yeast in it, but it's really the milky stuff off the top that we really want. And we're gonna pour off a lot of this other stuff anyway, so not a big deal. But this milky layer is what we really want from these. All right, so here we go. Got 2 mason jars. I got a bunch of lids in here. I'm gonna take a couple of these out of here. What we're gonna do is we're gonna put these things just gently over the top, just enough to snug them down. But again, we want them to be able to burp or breathe a little bit, so we're not gonna tighten them all the way. We're just gonna tighten them so nothing else gets in there. And then we're gonna put them in our refrigerator for about 24 to 48 hours. I'm gonna show you what that looks like when we come back. And then we'll talk about how to reuse and pitch this and the time frame in which you need to use it. All right, guys, we are back 24 hours or so later, and you can tell the difference now in the jars. So we have a lot of old spent beer and stuff. All of our trub and mostly yeast, there's probably a little trub left in this, but mostly yeast is now caked down at the bottom of both of these jars. So when you go and you use these, it's okay to keep them just like they are for a little bit. You could actually decant these off and add them and combine them together if you want to, but you could essentially use these for 2 different beers. So there's no need to dump both of them into one beer. All right, so reusing one of these things, you can definitely make a liter starter out of one of these. Go ahead and just dump that in, make it like normal. You don't have to. If you do anything that's under about 1050 original gravity or 1.050, I'd say as long as you're using it within the first few weeks, go ahead and just decant off the top and then pitch the yeast cake right in there. That's gonna be a lot more yeast than you'd normally get in a vial. But the longer that you leave this in your refrigerator, the longer period of time that goes by, you're gonna have some yeast that eventually just die off over time. And so you can make a yeast starter depending on how long you have this in your refrigerator. The only difference is if you're doing a Kveik yeast. Kveik yeast can be stored in your refrigerator for up to a year or so. They're a little bit hardier of a yeast. You can actually dehydrate it and keep it up to 20 years in your freezer. And the way you would do that is actually decant off as much of the liquid as you possibly can. You can even use the slurry directly out of your fermenter, but I would suggest maybe washing it first just so you're not, you get a little bit more of the yeast itself in the dehydration process. And then what you do is you spread it out on a sheet pan with parchment paper, and you can actually spread it out in a thin layer, and then you bake that very low temperature. So we're talking 80 or 90 degrees, because you don't want to kill the yeast again. If you have it over 100, getting upwards of 120 or higher, you're gonna kill the yeast off, and then it's gonna do absolutely nothing. But go ahead and bake that, or even use a dehydrator in order to make sure all of the liquid is out. Once it's actually, a crusty little chips, you can actually flake that off, put it in a Ziploc bag or even vacuum seal it, and keep it in your freezer for up to 20 years, they said. So that's how they used to get these old ancient yeasts, because they've dried out over time and they've rehydrated them, and then now they're active culture. So you can go ahead and do that if it's not going to be a long time before you're going to be reusing. But again, that's only for Kveik style yeast. It's not for your regular ale yeast. You're not going to want to try and dehydrate, White Labs at 001 or something like that. In that case, you would want to use that within the 3 to 4 week kind of window, or else don't use it at all. All right, guys, I hope you guys learned something. Rewashing and reusing your Trub or yeast is a huge money saver. One of your most expensive items to purchase when making a beer is yeast. I mean, they can run anywhere from $6 all the way up to $15 to $20 depending on the type of yeast that you're buying. And so what I would suggest doing is reusing it, especially if it's a yeast that you use all of the time. There's also a way of how to harvest yeast from commercial beers like Bell's Brewery, right? They don't filter any of their beers, and you can use their house yeast, which is Imperial A62, to make their actual own beers from their brewery. I have a video on how to do that, and I'll link that in the video description below. I also have a video on Kveik Yeast, and if you're not familiar with how to use Kveik Yeast, go ahead and check that video out. It goes through that whole process and why Kveik is really a special yeast when it comes to temperature control and speed in which you can ferment a beer. Add any questions or comments that you have below. I like answering questions from people. That's what this channel is all about, helping you become a better brewer. So hit that like and subscribe button. Happy brewing, and cheers.